So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings. Welcome to the April Ipsos Inside Track webinar. We are really happy to be with you today. I am Chris Jackson, head of the public polling team. I am joined by our editorial director, Sarah Feldman, and our data journalist, Bernard Mendez. We have a lot of data to share with you today, so we will dive right in. But as always, this is all public information, public data. It's all actually available on the Ipsos website. And as Ellen said, this presentation and webinar recording will also be posted on the Ipsos webinar in the coming days. If you have any questions during the webinar, don't hesitate to use the Q&A function of the GoToMeeting application. If you ever have any questions about Ipsos polling just in general, please don't hesitate to reach out to Sarah, Bernard, or I, and we're more than happy to chat. So, like I said, we have a bit of a packed agenda. I'm going to start us off talking about the issue landscape, what Americans are worried about. Then Sarah is going to run us through our latest polling on a number of those issues. As you can see, we have a number of topics we're going to be touching on lightly. And then Bernard is going to do a little bit of a deep dive for you on some of the election data that we're seeing, some of the interesting trends we're observing in the public opinion polling, before I then end the webinar session with our current forecast for this November and then our Q&A period. So what are the main issues driving the American landscape right now? Well, if you've been with us before, this chart probably looks a little bit familiar. We're seeing essentially the same handful of issues at the top of the issue landscape. Political extremism, sort of number one, and then right behind that, almost essentially tied, the economy and immigration as sort of the second, tied for second issues, though again, I think you can really sort of talk about all three of these topics as essentially sort of at the same level of concern. And this is actually interesting, and we'll actually see this come up a number of different ways throughout this webinar, because these are really the issues driving the election and driving sort of the conflicts in modern American society. On the right, immigration is a major issue, is a big cause of concern. On the left, it's political extremism, threats to democracy, democratic backsliding. And then sort of with everybody, but particularly with people who are unaffiliated yet, the economy and particularly cost of living, inflation issues are still a very big concern. And then there's another number of other issues further down the issue landscape that are important, even if they aren't necessarily at that top tier. Things like crime, healthcare, abortion, climate. These are issues that will probably matter for the election this fall, even though they're not necessarily the number one concern for Americans. But with an election that's oftentimes decided by a fraction of a percent of the American public, the difference is a fraction of a percent of the American public, even these smaller issues, these issues that are less widely concerns, may have a big impact on what we see happen this fall. Now, looking over time, over the last couple of months, we're seeing relative stability in sort of the issue landscape, but I do think it's worth noting that there has been a little bit of a gap between political extremism and the economy and immigration open up over the last 2 months. We think this is an interesting phenomenon, and we think watching this phenomenon over time is going to tell us a lot about the election, because essentially at this moment in time, Donald Trump is stronger on two of these three issues, while Biden is stronger on one. Biden, of course, is stronger on the democracy issue. Trump is stronger on the economy and immigration. And as long as the three are sort of tied at the top of the tier, it suggests Trump's sort of got the advantage. But if we see any of these other issues sort of slide down the issue landscape, then perhaps Biden's strength in democracy becomes more important. Again, very much bears watching. And particularly, we think it's going to be worth watching what happens with concerns about the economy. Right now, Americans are still feeling a bit of economic pressure from cost of living, but we're seeing actually both in the US and around the world, concerns about inflation are going down ever so slowly. So we're seeing declining concerns with inflation, and the question becomes, does that project out to sort of improving perceptions of Biden's job performance? You have to stay tuned to see, but I will now hand over to Sarah actually to do a little bit of a deep dive into the economy and then through a number of the other issues animating the election so far this year. Sarah?
Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, just kick us off. As Chris mentioned, we'll be talking about the economy. And here we're looking at our consumer confidence tracker data going back to 2002. Now, as you can see in the past few months, we've seen consumer confidence nudge up as consumer perception catches up with some of those macroeconomic indicators. Now, where consumer confidence isn't exactly where we'd expect it to be given the macroeconomic environment. Inflation has come down quite a bit and it remains relatively low, if not stubbornly stuck at that 3.5% place. Unemployment rate remains low. Few Americans know people who have lost their job recently. So, consumer perceptions around the economy is quite lukewarm, quite tepid. It's improving somewhat, as Chris mentioned, with concern about inflation slowly creeping down as an issue, but people aren't feeling exuberant or over the top about the economy and their place in it. And that really matters for Biden because of economy falling as an issue certainly opens up more terrain, more airtime for issues that are more favorable to the president and his campaign. And a candidate that performs best on the main issue tends to win their re-election or their election. So this is an important space to watch in the months and weeks ahead, how people's relationship to the economy develops and whether we see any improvement there. Now, moving on to our next big ticket news item, like Chris said, we'll be running through a number of different news items today in kind of a rapid fire, spit and fire take. So first, to start us off, we're looking at some polling we did with Reuters on the Trump trials, on some of the charges that are brought against the former president. And as we can see among registered voters, majorities do view these charges as serious. Notably, the case before the New York courts this week, over the past few weeks, the Stormy Daniels charges are viewed a little bit less seriously as some of the other charges, but still majorities of registered voters find these charges serious. Now, in this hyper-partisan, very siloed media environment where people are watching and listening to news that oftentimes reflects their political leanings, how serious these charges isn't always the most important question to be asking, but how believable a lot of people find these charges as well. And this chart here really captures some of those different sentiments, some of those factors at play and how people are making sense of these really historic cases against the former president. Now, just to take a step back and walk you through what we're looking at here, on the x-axis, we're looking at believability, how believable or not people find these cases, and on the y-axis, so running up and down vertically, is how serious people find these cases. Now, some surprising and unsurprising things to start with, something a little bit less shocking maybe for people who tune into this webinar monthly. Democratic registered voters find all of the cases against Trump to be believable and serious. Speaking to that partisan take and partisan absorption of some of these cases and how people are making sense of it. Now, Americans overall find most of these cases to be both believable and serious as well, falling in that upper right-hand quadrant. And we see a more diffuse, more kind of spread out opinion among Republican registered voters, very interestingly. Now, most of these Republican registered voters don't find the charges against Trump to be that serious. What really separates Republican registered voters and their opinions around the Trump trials is how believable these cases are. And of note, for the New York case, a bare majority of Republican registered voters find the charges revolving around Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal hush money to be the most believable among the different cases against Trump right now. So while partisanship certainly covers and shapes a lot of attitudes around the Trump trial cases, there's certainly nuances when you look under the hood and start parsing out some of those partisan differences and how people are observing and making sense of such a historic moment for the country. Moving on, another major storyline coming out of the trials over the past few weeks is the selection of jurors. In polling we did last summer that we provided exclusively to the New York Times, we asked Americans how confident they were in the court's ability to find impartial jurors who would really be considering the facts of the case as the court presents it to the jury, rather and put aside their pre-existing ideas and beliefs about Trump. And across the board, regardless of partisanship, very few Americans feel confident in the court's ability to find that kind of impartiality piece of the jury selection, given how notable and famous and divisive Trump is as a public figure in American life right now. Interestingly, kind of piecing into that a little bit more, in that same poll that we covered around the justice system more broadly, we asked Americans whether they would be interested in serving on a jury for one of the Trump cases if they were eligible. And very few Americans, well, a plurality, 45%, said that they would be interested in serving on a Trump jury. Now, that rises for Republicans and Democrats. Partisans are a little bit more interested in the opportunity to serve on a jury for Trump, on a Trump case, as are those who have served on jury duty before. So some really interesting views on the jury selection piece, not a widely covered arena in public opinion polling. So this is a very unique and fascinating piece of research for a very unique and historic period of time that I encourage everyone to check out. Moving on to our third big topic, one of the three main issues, immigration, that Chris mentioned at the top. I want to do some level setting here around views on immigration. Immigration tends to be a very partisan issue. Concern about immigration tends to be a very partisan issue. Republicans tend to be a little bit more concerned about immigration than Democrats or independents. And you can really see that come through in this slide on immigration reform. Now we're seeing majorities, most Republicans supporting some more hardline immigration measures around building a fence or wall along the US-Mexico border, and increasing deportations for migrants who enter the country illegally. On the other side of things, we see Democrats more supportive of creating pathways to citizenships for migrants who enter the country illegally. So a lot of these attitudes around immigration really are coming from and shaped by those partisan attitudes and leanings that we talk about so much in these presentations. Now, partisanship is not the only demographic that is important to consider when we're thinking about immigration as an issue. Race, ethnicity also matters quite a bit. And here we're looking at some polling we did with Axios in partnership with Telemundo, or our quarterly Axios Ipsos Latino poll. And we're testing some of those same immigration reforms we looked at on the previous slide among the general public, but here looking specifically at how Latino Americans feel about some of these things. And we can see that over time, over the past 2 years or so, Latino Americans have warmed up, have grown more supportive of some of those hardline immigration reform measures, like creating a wall at the US-Mexico border or deporting migrants who enter the country illegally. Now, we still see support among Latinos lower, softer than among the general public, but that double-digit increase over the past 2 years is notable and an important thing to keep in mind as we think through how this community really feels about some of these immigration reforms. It's worth noting and contextualizing too that a majority of Latino Americans still support providing other immigration reforms, like providing a pathway to citizenship for migrants who enter the country illegally, which is all to say that this community really has some diffuse opinions around immigration and immigration reform. We see 2 in 3 supporting things like a pathway to citizenship for people who enter the country illegally, and also an equal share supporting policies like giving the president authority to shut down the US border if there are too many migrants entering the country. So really complicated and nuanced landscape when it comes to Latino opinions around immigration reform, which I think really speaks to how heterogeneous and not a monolith the Latino community is in their political opinions, which we'll get into a little bit later in the presentation, so stay tuned for that. Now on to another big ticket item in the news of late, foreign policy. Here we're looking at some attitudes towards US policy in the Middle East and how Americans feel about that. Now, the war in Gaza has been a big ticket item in the news cycle over the past few weeks, with protests sweeping across college campuses and escalating tensions in the Middle East. And we can really see how some opinion here fractures along partisan lines. Now, here we're looking at some polling we did with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, a great client, around US opinion. And we can see that Republicans are more unified in how they feel about US policy in the Middle East, with more, a plurality, 49%, feeling that the US should let Israel pursue whatever policy it thinks is best without any pressure from the US. Democrats are more divided, with some thinking that the US should reduce military aid to Israel until it ends its war with Hamas, and an almost equal share, slightly fewer, feeling that they haven't really heard enough to speak on the issue. So, the Middle East really unifies Republicans in many ways and divides Democrats. And when it comes to policy around Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, we really see the opposite effect here. Now, we're also looking here at some trended polling we did with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs around opinion of the US providing economic assistance to Ukraine. And over time, over the past 2 years or so, we can really see how soft and how far Republican and independent support for that policy has fallen over the past 2 years. Now, Democrat support for providing economic assistance to Ukraine has softened somewhat as well, but not to the same extent that opinion among independents and Republicans have. And these last two slides around the Middle East and Ukraine really speak to, and I think reflect, some of the congressional and legislative challenges that have been presented around passing legislation to send aid to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. Now, we've just seen a bill go to the Senate and likely is going to Biden's desk soon, but that was months and months in the making, and in part is reflective of and indicative of these fractured opinions around both Ukraine and Israel, with inter-party conflict and also between party conflict. So really interesting stuff and an important thing to keep in mind as we think through the election. And Bernard will be walking us through some of the electoral consequences of things we should be considering looking into 2024. Now on to our fifth topic, reproductive rights. Also something that has made a lot of news over the past month. It's been a busy month. I want to do some level setting. A lot of the news that has broken over the past month has been state-based, but want to take a step back and walk us through, where the country is overall. And when we look at measures for abortion, policies around abortion, like a nationwide ban on abortion at 16 weeks of pregnancy, we see most Americans opposing such an abortion ban, but we see that nationwide ban at 6 weeks really acting as a unifying force for Republicans. Now, for more restrictive measures, for more restrictive abortion policies like a 6-week ban, that fractures Republican opinion a lot. Oftentimes in these past webinars, we've talked about how reproductive rights can really act as a wedge issue for Republicans. And that 16-week ban, we see, unifying Republicans a little bit more than some of the other policies that have been kicked around at the state level. Now, while that unifies Republicans, it certainly does not bring a lot of independents or Democrats along for the ride. But, an important some level setting to do as Trump has come out in support of a nationwide ban on abortion at 16 weeks of pregnancy. Now, getting into some of those state-based developments, in Florida, we did some great polling with USA Today on the ballot measure that will be going before Florida voters in 2024. And we find that among registered voters in Florida, a majority, about 3 in 5, would vote for making abortion legal up until fetal viability, which is about 24 weeks. Now, we see majority support around Democrats and independents, less support among Republican registered voters in Florida. But what's important to kind of keep in mind here at the state level is that we've seen since Dobbs that abortion and these ballot measures can really be a galvanizing force for Democrats and drive turnout in a lot of these elections. And that's something that will definitely be important to be paying attention to looking into 2024. Now on to our last big ticket item as we get closer to the election. understanding how certain communities within the US are experiencing the election, what they've lived through and how they've experienced the past few years, is going to be very important in understanding how and who shows up to vote come November. So returning to our Axios Ipsos Latino poll that we've done in partnership with Telemundo, we can really see how fewer Latinos really now feel that it's a good time to be Latino in America, something that's changed significantly over the past 2 years or so. And what the important question to ask coming out of this data is, how does that go on to affect who Latinos vote for, who they support, and how the different candidates and parties perform on key issues? And here we can really see Trump overperforming Republicans with Latinos on key issues and Biden underperforming Democrats. So on key kind of sentiments like representing people like me, caring about Latino and Hispanic Americans, good on abortion issues, we see Democrats perform the best. Biden underperforms Democrats on each of these key areas. But on the most important issue for Latino Americans, the economy, inflation, we see Trump overperforming Republicans, overperforming Democrats and Biden for that matter by quite a long shot. So, Trump seems to have an advantage on this issue among the Latino community, and that is an important thing to be keeping in mind as we think through, the issue landscape and how different Americans are feeling about the candidates and the issues at play for 2024. With that, I will turn it over to Bernard for his Inside Track client-facing debut, and he'll walk us through our 2024 updates and some interesting findings on voting.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about where the landscape is heading into November and where things might end up. So on the next slide, I'll start off talking a bit about President Biden's approval. In our latest Inside Track, our latest core political, we find that Biden has around a 38% approval. He's still hovering at this, high 30s, low 40s percentage mark, which, based on our previous analysis, would give an incumbent around a 50-50 shot at re-election. So right now, Biden's current approval gives him around a 50-50 chance at re-election. This is significant because, one thing that we've also seen based on past global elections is that presidents presiding over good or improving economies have typically seen a boost in their approval rating heading into an election. That doesn't seem to have kicked off for Biden yet, if it ever will, but we have seen consumer confidence tick up a bit. I think we saw that early in the presentation. So it'll be interesting to watch to see whether Biden's approval also takes a tick up over the next few months, which would give him a better shot at re-election. So on the next slide, I'll talk a bit about the general ballot. We see that, as polling has been over the past couple of months, things are still roughly a tie, still pretty much within the margin of error. But one thing that also has broken through over the past couple of months is that Biden does tend to do slightly better among people who are registered voters or people who say that they're more likely to vote. And, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how things are going to pan out this November. It isn't necessarily predictive, but it is just something worth keeping an eye on. And the next slide, I think, shows this, in effect a bit more, where people who voted in 2016 and 2020 tend to lean slightly more towards Biden, while people who leaned more towards Trump or who didn't vote in 2016 or 2020 tend to lean more towards Trump. And, this sort of makes up the majority of the population, people who have pretty stable voting habits. So it's just one thing to keep in mind that people who, are registered to vote, are likely to vote, have voted in the past, have a slight Biden lean, while people who don't really vote have a slight or more Trump lean. So on the next slide, so this is a bit of the issue landscape. Chris discussed this a bit earlier, but there hasn't been a whole lot of movement here. Biden does pretty well among issues that are typically seen as Democratic issues, like climate change, like abortion. He also does really well when it comes to lowering student debt. Trump, on the other hand, does really well on those, right-leaning issues. I think most notably, he does much better than Biden on the economy and in immigration, which we saw in an earlier slide, are two of the three, top issues Americans feel the country is facing right now. Not pictured is how Americans feel Biden or Trump handle threats to democracy, which Biden typically performs better at. We just didn't ask this in this poll. But that is to say, there's a good deal of stability when it comes to preferring Biden or Trump on certain issues. and it overall leads to a somewhat complicated issue landscape. So on the next slide. So this is what's at stake this November. Obviously, we have the presidential election, which, I'm sure you've heard a lot about, but there are also all the seats in the House of Representatives are up for grabs, as they are every 2 years. I think most notably, there are 34 seats in the Senate that are up for grabs. This is notable because you can see that 20 of them are Democratic seats, 11 are Republican seats, which suggests that Democrats are a bit more vulnerable in the Senate, which is why some pundits or forecasters feel that this is an area where Republicans can make up ground because there are more vulnerable seats for Democrats. There are 11 gubernatorial elections. Most of these, though, are safe Republican or safe Democrat states, except for potentially North Carolina. But the majority of these are somewhat decided already. And right now, there are currently 3 abortion ballot measures on the ballot this November, most notably in Florida, which Sarah talked a bit about earlier, as well as Arizona. But there are also 8 that are sort of pending that might be on the ballot this November. And that's just something worth keeping an eye out on because, as we saw in the 2022 midterms, abortion really is an issue that drives people to the poll and makes an impact on elections. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk a bit about how 2 issues that have been very prominent in the news over the past couple months have been affecting voters' minds, specifically Biden's policy when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war and Trump's court cases, legal woes, etc. So on the next slide. So the big narrative, or a big narrative that has been floating around, is that Biden's policy when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war and his inability to push for a ceasefire, etc., has upset the Democratic base and may lead to some Democrats to not vote for him this November as a way to protest his policy here. And so to sort of analyze whether that is actually happening, I looked at Democrats, specifically Democrats who aren't planning to vote for Biden and also happen to feel that Israel's response in Gaza has been excessive. As you can see, that's about half of Biden voters. You can also see that there are a similar level of Republicans not planning to vote for Trump. So that, at least on the surface, suggests that Biden isn't losing too much of the Democratic base simply because of his policy there. But on the next slide, we do see that these voters who are Democratic aren't planning to vote for Biden and also feel Israel's response in Gaza has been excessive tend to look pretty different than the general Biden voting Democratic base. They're much more racially diverse, they're much younger, they're much more female. But I think most notably, they're a lot less likely to say that they're going to vote in the 2024 election. And, this can say one of 2 things, or it can say both. But it could say that these are people that have seen Biden's policy in Gaza and feel that they're not going to vote because of that, or they're people that were just less likely to vote in the first place and happen to also feel that Israel's response to Gaza has been excessive. So on the next slide, we do see that these Democrats would still lean towards Biden if they had to choose. 8 and 10 would opt for Biden if they had to choose. Just the majority of them wouldn't do so because of Biden. They mostly do it as a vote against Donald Trump. A big part of this election, especially for Biden, is the anti-vote against Trump. This is especially the case among these voters who, again, aren't planning to vote for Biden, but feel that Israel's response in Gaza has been excessive. But on the next slide, we do find that, war and foreign conflicts isn't top of mind for most Democrats. They tend to be more concerned about issues closer to home, like political extremism, like the economy. And, that sort of lines up with how most Americans also feel about war and foreign conflicts, which, all combined suggest that, while Biden's policy in Gaza may be affecting him among key groups like non-white voters, like younger voters, and like female voters, it doesn't seem to be eating away at his base too much. But, because this election is so close, both candidates need, as many voters as they can possibly get. So if Biden's policy in Gaza is the reason why they are reluctant to vote, that could end up coming back to haunt him come November. So on the next slide, I'll talk a bit about Donald Trump's legal cases. I think this slide is kind of interesting because, when it comes to the criminal cases against Trump, Americans pretty much speak in absolutes. They pretty much all fall under, the criminal cases having no impact or having a much more or much less likely impact on their likelihood to vote for him, especially among Republicans, especially among Democrats, which to me suggests that, all the most impactful thing these criminal cases have done, at least when it comes to voters, is sort of reinforce their pre-existing opinions of Donald Trump, or just not changing their opinion of Donald Trump whatsoever. But it is notable that Americans are more likely to say that these criminal cases make them less likely to vote for Trump rather than more likely to vote for Trump, including 10% of Republicans. So on the next slide, I just looked at the Trump voting base here. So people who voted for Trump in 2020 and are planning to vote for Trump in 2024. That's about 2/3 of Republicans, a quarter of all Americans. We do find that there is a somewhat significant minority that say that they would not vote for Trump if he were convicted or if he were serving time in prison. And this isn't a lot of them, but that could swing the election, as we see in the next slide. When you assume that these people, honor those opinions they expressed in the previous slide, we do find that things again shift back towards Biden. In the general ballot is roughly tied. If he were convicted, Biden has a slight lead. And if Trump were serving time in prison, that lead lengthens. Obviously, this is a very hypothetical scenario, and whether these Trump voters feel that the trials are rigged or they were fair or not, or politically motivated or not, will ultimately impact whether they actually honor, what they said in the previous question. But these convictions, these prison sentences potentially could have a big impact on the election. But that is all for my section. With that, I'll hand it back over to Chris, who will talk a bit about our forecasting.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Sarah. So lots of interesting data, lots of information suggesting that circumstances right now may look pretty good for Trump, but there is a lot of risk out there. So what does that mean for what's going to happen this November? Well, first off, always we want to caveat that a poll, a survey, is a moment in time. It's a snapshot of essentially the past, and it does not necessarily tell us what's going to happen in the future. And indeed, our perspective at Ipsos is the best way to forecast what's going to happen is to look across a number of different indicators and create a summary judgment. So that's what we do. So first off, let's look at what some other experts are actually saying right now. And there's not a lot of people quite yet that are actually getting out on a limb and making a call, including us, really. We see a number of experts, the UVA Crystal Ball, Larry Sabato, Inside Election, Cook Political Report, CN Analysis, all essentially saying that the election's a toss-up. What they've done is they've sort of gone through and sort of said, these are states Trump's going to win, these are states Biden's going to win, and then there's enough states that are just too close to call to really call the election. CNN, which has got a poll-based model, is saying that Trump is in the winning position right now, having at least 270 electoral college vote worth of states that he is winning in. And then the other poll models are all essentially within the margin of error, but saying that it's leaning Trump at the moment, except for the race to the White House model, which is leaning Biden. But again, all essentially within a percentage point or so of a tie. So it does suggest that things are very close, but I think the key summary is that the conventional wisdom right now is that it's a toss-up, that it's too close to call, it's too early, we don't necessarily know how things are going to play out. So what does Ipsos think? Well, we look at these things and we build a model based on a number of different indicators, what we're seeing in the polling, and because this isn't truly a national election, it's an election of the states, we actually break the polling down into what we're seeing in some of the key regions of the country, particularly the Midwest, which is Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, sort of that key belt of states that Biden was able to win last time, but that Trump won in 2016. The Southeast, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and then the Southwest, Arizona and Nevada, maybe Texas on some days, but probably not. And what do we see happening there? Well, Biden's polling in the Midwest actually has gotten a little bit better. the polls there are essentially showing basically a tie. So that's a bit of an improvement. But in the Southeast and the Southwest, Trump is still leading in the polling sort of at that state level by, between 2 and 7 percentage points, depending on the state. Then we look at our base rate model, which is based on Biden's approval rating. Like Bernard mentioned, a president at a 40% approval is essentially 50-50. So what we see is, again, in the Midwest, Biden's approval is about at that 40% range. He's, doing a little bit better there, a little bit more popular there. But in the Southeast and the Southwest, his approval's in the mid 30s, suggesting that, he's a little bit underwater, a little bit more at risk there. Then we look at what the main issues are, and it depends on what you think the main issue in the state is. It really does vary a significant degree if it's the economy or if it's politics. If it's the economy, Trump is in a stronger position. If it's sort of political extremism, polarization, Biden is in the stronger position. Those numbers sort of vary a little bit by state, but they are pretty closely tied. Fundraising, Biden's actually doing better than Trump on that. Attention, that's essentially media attention. Trump is doing better in that space. Maybe it's not all good attention, but he definitely gets a lot more of it, all things equal. And then sort of what the forecasters are saying at the moment. And right now, the forecasters are sort of saying that Biden's chances in the Midwest are actually relatively okay. In the Southwest, it's a toss-up, and in the Southeast, Biden's actually a little underwater in North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida again. So what does that say? Well, at the macro level, the Midwest is really truly a toss-up at the moment, but Trump is leading in the other two regions of the country. And basically, one of the two needs to win 2 out of these 3 regions to be able to win the election. That's kind of a rule of thumb that you can follow. Of course, the actual electoral college math is a little bit more complicated, but winning 2 of those 3 is necessary to win the election, all things equal. If not winning all 3 of them is required. So really right now, it looks like Trump is in actually the stronger position, as has been the case really for the last couple of months. So as we look forward over time, what do we see? Well, in this current scenario, the status quo with Biden's approval rating relatively weak, economic discontent relatively high, Trump is likely in the advanced position. However, again, as Bernard mentioned a little earlier, we do see incumbent presidents tend to improve in their approval rating over the course of a campaign cycle, somewhere between 5 and 8 percentage points, especially if the economy is generally healthy. And if that does happen, that would push Biden up into the mid 40s in his approval rating. That puts him decidedly in more strong position. Polling would likely swing in his favor as well. So in that circumstance, essentially, if we sort of see historical trends continue, Biden would likely be in the stronger position. However, in 1 out of 3 elections in the United States over the past 4 decades, something has happened during the election year that was unanticipated at the start of the year. Could be a conflict, could be a recession, could be a pandemic. Maybe it's a jury verdict, that this unprecedented situation in the United States. Who knows? But you can't really predict what effect that's going to happen. But again, in 1 in 3 cases over the past 40 years, we've seen some sort of thing happen in the election year. So it's always worth keeping that in mind as we look forward. So we essentially see right now, Trump is in the driver's seat. He has the strongest position. But again, if historical patterns hold, we should see Biden likely pulling into the stronger position by November. But again, Trump has kind of broken a lot of other things about American politics and governance. So maybe he's broken these patterns as well. We will have to see. And that's why you should keep tuning in every month for the Inside Track to see what the latest updates are and see how these patterns are emerging. So with that, I think it is time for questions. So like we said earlier, please don't hesitate to use that Q&A button on the meeting application to log your questions. Sarah, Bernard, and I will go through as many of them as we can. And if we don't get to your question, we run out of time, we will certainly send you an email with a response. Let's see what we got. First question, have we looked at this data for swing states? So I'm not sure what this data was referring to. I think there's a couple of different things for swing states. One, looking at the main issue data, which we presented at the top of the meeting, In the swing states, the economy is actually more clearly the #1 issue, and politics and immigration are further down the list. So we do see sort of the order sort of changes up. Politics and partisanship tends to be a much bigger issue in the Democratic states, like California, New York, places like that. Immigration tends to be a bigger issue in Republican states, Texas, Florida, places like that. And then the economy tends to be the bigger issue in these sort of swingier states. And again, that's one of the things, as we mentioned several times, that is a problem for Biden, that his ratings with the economy are so poor because it remains sort of a key issue across a lot of the country, particularly in some of these most politically important places and with some of the most politically swingy groups like Latinos, like young people. So that is one of the key things to watch is, do people feel like the economy is getting better? Do they give Biden more credit for it? Or does it just sort of slide off the agenda? We'll see. Other questions? All right, here's a question. I don't know, Sarah, Bernard, if one of you want to take it. Does Harris's presence on the Democratic slate have any impact on Biden's standing? I don't know if we have any data on that yet.
Yeah, we are definitely, we've kicked around the idea of pulling more on Harris once Trump's announced his running mate. So we have some balanced research to take a look at. But, in previous research we've done, and this is now a year old at this point, Harris, doesn't seem to make as big of an impact on Biden in the ballot. People tend to not pay attention as much to the VP as to the president, as memorialized in the show Veep. If anyone has taken a look at that, I think that is true to form. We've did some polling on that, and a lot of DC insiders do feel that Veep is true to form. So, not as prominent as the president as the top of the ticket.
Yeah, as a DC resident, I can say that Veep is a much more accurate depiction of how the city works than something like House of Cards, which suggests that people are uber competent. Not really the case. Next question. Have we looked at what an acquittal would do for Trump's standing? I don't know, Sarah, Bernard. I don't think we've asked that question specifically, but I don't know if you have any data that might suggest what would happen if Trump is acquitted.
We haven't looked at that specifically. It's an interesting question. I think a lot of the questions surrounding the Trump trial is we're asking people this in a vacuum with things that haven't happened yet. So they give us one reaction, and once something happens, once the actual news breaks, they may have another reaction, which is why it's so important to keep coming back to these issues over time and paying attention to what's going on as the news changes and breaks. So that's something we'll definitely be paying attention to looking ahead.
Yeah, very well said. So that's all the questions I see. If anyone else has something they want to log in, please, by all means. Otherwise, I'll hand it back over to Ellen to close the meeting. I don't know, Ellen, if you have the date for our next session to share with everyone, but thank you for joining us.
Yes, actually, we do have the date of the next session. It is May 28th, so please put that in your calendars and expect to see a registration link for that when you see the recording in your email box. So thank you, Chris, Sarah, and also to Bernard, who's joined the series. And thank you all for joining us. We'll be back next month. Have a wonderful day.